All right, so you want to know what's happening with this Japanese election.
Yeah.
And things are really starting to heat up over there. It is fascinating stuff. We've been looking through all the latest reports from NHK, Japan's national broadcaster,
Right.
to get you all the need-to-know details about what looks like it's going to be a really interesting election.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned it's heating up because in Japan, they're calling it a super short decisive battle. That's how the Komeito leader described it, actually?
Okay, super short decisive battle. That has a ring to it. What does that even mean for this election?
Well, essentially, it means the campaign period is going to be really short, really intense. It kind of adds a whole other layer to this election, don't you think?
Mm-hmm.
Because campaigning is going to look totally different with this really tight timeline. We're thinking less about the traditional long campaigns and more about quick online strategies, media appearances.
Yeah.
I think it'll be really fascinating to see how the different parties adapt.
Yeah, absolutely. So the pressure is definitely on, especially for Prime Minister Ishiba and the ruling LDP. They're trying to project this image of a rule-abiding party. But with all this recent scrutiny over these political funding scandals, do you think voters are buying it?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right? The LDP is basically trying to convince voters that they're turning over a new leaf. But there's a lot of skepticism. It's not really the first time that they've promised reform.
Right.
Remember the envelope scandal from a few years back?
Oh, right. How could we forget that? That was huge.
Exactly. So when they start using phrases like rule-abiding party, you can understand why some voters might be a little bit skeptical.
Yeah.
I mean, the LDP's been in this position before, and I think the electorate's going to be watching very, very closely to see if these promises actually translate into real change this time around.
It sounds like the LDP is walking a tightrope here. They have to kind of appease their own party while also winning back public trust. And speaking of trust, there's this whole debate over these policy activity funds that are given to Japanese lawmakers. What are these funds all about?
Well, they've actually been a point of contention for a while now because of the lack of transparency surrounding them. The LDP is saying they want more transparency, which on the surface sounds good, right? But their coalition partner, the Komeito Party, is taking a much stronger stance. They're calling for these funds to be abolished completely.
Wow, that's a pretty bold move, especially coming from their own coalition partners. What's the strategy there?
Well, the Komeito Party has always kind of branded themselves as the clean government party. So by taking this really hard line on this particular issue, especially right before an election, they're really trying to draw this clear distinction between themselves and the LDP. It's a way for them to really capitalize on the public's concerns about corruption and to position themselves as the party that's serious about cleaning up politics.
So they're trying to appeal to voters who are disillusioned with the whole system and want to see real change.
Exactly. And puts Ishiba in a really tricky spot because he needs the Komeito Party's support to maintain the coalition. But their stance on this issue could alienate some of his own party members who actually benefit from these funds. Yeah. It's a classic case of political maneuvering where everyone's trying to come out on top.
Yeah, it's like a political thriller playing out in real time. We've got these scandals and promises of reform, a super short election timeline, and then this whole other layer of coalition politics.
Absolutely. And you know what? We haven't even touched on the policy details yet. The economy, foreign policy, or the environment. There's just so much to unpack as this election unfolds.
Well, on that note, we're going to take a quick pause here and come back for part 2 of our deep dive into this Japanese election. Don't go anywhere, because we're going to unpack even more of those details next. So we're back, and we are ready to dive even deeper into this super short, decisive battle that is the Japanese election. I think it's really easy to get swept up in all the political back and forth.
Right.
But it's important to remember that these decisions actually impact people's lives in very real ways.
Yeah.
And one thing that really stood out to me was the emphasis on disaster preparedness.
Yeah, and you're right to highlight that Japan is incredibly vulnerable to earthquakes and tsunamis.
Yeah.
It's just a fact of life there, and it definitely shapes how people view their leaders.
Yeah, especially with that recent earthquake still fresh in everyone's minds. I can see why it's such a big issue this time around. The LDP is even pledging to create this whole new disaster management agency, which seems like a pretty huge deal.
It is a significant move. And it's interesting because Japan already has a pretty extensive disaster preparedness system in place.
Right.
But this new agency suggests that they're looking to centralize things even further, maybe streamline things a little bit. It really emphasizes the importance they're placing on disaster preparedness in this election.
It makes you wonder, though, if this is a genuine effort to address what is obviously a very critical issue, or is it maybe a way for the LDP to kind of I don't know, look proactive and maybe deflect from some of those political funding scandals that we talked about earlier?
That's the question, isn't it? And I'm sure it's something that a lot of voters are thinking about, too. On the one hand, you could see it as the LDP trying to project strength and capability in an area where they know the people are concerned.
Right.
But on the other hand, this new agency could actually represent a real commitment to strengthening what is already a very robust system. I think only time will tell how this actually plays out and how the public ultimately perceives it.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that this election isn't just some abstract political game. These decisions have real-world consequences for real people.
Absolutely. And that's what I think makes this particular election so fascinating. You have these very real, very pressing concerns like we've been talking about with disaster preparedness.
Right.
And they're all intertwined with these internal political battles and this underlying current of public distrust is going on.
It's a lot to unpack. Speaking of unpacking, we've talked a lot about the LDP. What about the Camito Party?
Right.
I mean, they're not exactly shying away from pushing for some big changes, especially when it comes to those policy activity funds. What else is on their agenda?
Well, beyond the funds, they're really focusing on their traditional areas of strength,
Okay.
like education reform and social welfare issues. They're really trying to appeal to those voters who are looking for a party that really prioritizes things like social responsibility and ethical governance.
Which, again, plays into that whole clean government image that they're going for.
Exactly. And it's actually a very smart strategy considering the LDP's scandals. By positioning themselves as the party of integrity, they're offering voters a really clear alternative. I think it'll be interesting to see if that resonates with voters, especially with those who might be feeling disillusioned with the LDP.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how these two parties are both kind of subtly and sometimes not so subtly trying to differentiate themselves from each other on the campaign trail.
Yeah. Even though they are in a coalition, it's a delicate dance. They need each other to stay in power, but they also need to appeal to their own voters and carve out their own identities.
Yeah, this election is shaping up to be a real nail-biter. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
But there's still so much more to unpack as this super short, decisive battle unfolds.
And that's what makes it so interesting.
I know.
The stakes are high. The timeline is incredibly short.
Yeah.
And the political maneuvering is just constant.
Well, on that note, I think we should probably pause here and gear up for the final part of our deep dive into this Japanese election.
Okay.
We'll be right back to break down what this all actually means for you and the future of Japan. Stay tuned. All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into this Japanese election. And wow, you really weren't kidding. It is a whirlwind over there with this super short, decisive battle and promises of reform and a big focus on disaster preparedness. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And as we head into these last few weeks before the election, I think the big question on everyone's mind is, what does all of this actually mean for Japan?
Yeah, because it's really easy to get caught up in all the political drama of it all.
Right.
But at the end of the day, this is about the future of Japan and how these policies will affect people's everyday lives.
Exactly. And, thinking about it, I think one of the key takeaways here is that this election really boils down to trust.
Okay.
Can the LDP convince voters that they're really serious about becoming this rule-abiding party that they keep talking about?
Right. Especially with the memory of those past scandals still kind of hanging in the air.
Yeah.
It seems like the Camito Party really gets that, which is maybe why they're really playing up their image as the clean government alternative.
They're trying to own that narrative, for sure. And I think it's a smart move on their part.
Yeah.
Because, there is that undercurrent of disillusionment among some voters.
Right. So it's like if the LDP is trying to project this image of stability and experience, the Camito Party is offering voters something else, a chance for actual change, a break from the way things have always been done.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this election about more than just these individual policies.
Okay.
It's about this fundamental choice between two very different visions for the future of Japan.
It's almost like there's this question hanging over everything. Will the real LDP please stand up?
Right.
Are they actually going to put their money where their mouth is this time around?
Yeah, and to be fair to the LDP, they have made some big promises.
Yeah.
Creating this new disaster management agency is not a small thing.
Yeah.
It shows they're taking disaster preparedness seriously.
Which, as we've been talking about, is a huge issue for people in Japan. It's a good reminder that all this political stuff actually has real-world consequences.
Without a doubt.
Mm.
And I think that's something really important for everyone to remember as we get closer to Election Day. Look beyond just the words and pay attention to the actions. What are they actually doing?
It's like you said earlier, it all comes down to trust. The LDP has to show voters that they've learned from past mistakes and are ready to lead with integrity.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how everything plays out.
Yeah.
I think the Japanese voters are very much paying attention, and they aren't afraid to hold their leaders accountable.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here, what is your final thought for our listeners? What should they really be looking out for as we get closer and closer to Election Day?
I think the most important thing to watch is how the LDP handles these last few weeks.
All right.
Are they going to make any big moves to address those concerns about transparency and being accountable? Will they try to counter what the Komeito Party is doing? Or will they just double down on this message of experience and stability? I think the answers to those questions will probably decide this whole election.
Wow, you've given us a lot to think about. It sounds like this super short, decisive battle is going to be a photo finish we'll be watching closely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Japanese election.